Welcome back.
Uh, I have a somewhat bizarre question for you, and I need you to just kind of go with me on this.
Okay, I'm ready.
Why does poop smell bad?
Wow. Uh, yeah, that is a bizarre question.
Right.
But it's an incredibly profound one if you look at the evolutionary mechanics behind it.
How so?
Well, because objectively speaking, there is no universal law stating that waste has to smell repulsive.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask a fly, it smells incredible.
Yeah, to a fly, it's basically a nutrient-dense feast, right?
Exactly. It's the equivalent of a freshly baked pie to them.
So humans evolved to find that specific scent repulsive for, a highly practical reason.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine early humans wandering around the savannah. If a random genetic mutation caused one of them to think, wow, that smells delicious,
They probably ate it.
they ate it. And because human waste is packed with life-threatening bacteria, that early human got violently ill and crucially did not pass on that specific genetic mutation.
Disgust was literally an evolutionary shield. The individuals who survived were the ones whose biology naturally repelled them from the hazard.
Right.
They lived, they reproduced, and they passed that hardwired disgust down through the generations directly to you sitting there right now.
Which perfectly frames our mission for today's deep dive.
It really does.
And our goal today is to completely rewire how you think about evolution.
We're going to challenge those old survival of the fittest cliches you might have picked up in high school biology.
Yeah, we want to figure out what is truly driving the biology, the behavior, and the physical forms of every single living thing on Earth.
And doing that requires a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Because when we hear the phrase survival of the fittest, it sounds inherently logical. We all nod along.
We do.
But the framework demands a follow-up question. Survival of the fittest, what exactly? What is the actual unit of selection?
Okay, let's unpack this. If I ask you what survival of the fittest means, you probably picture a nature documentary.
Sure, a lion chasing a gazelle.
Exactly. The fastest gazelle lives to see another day, and the strongest lion gets to eat.
Right.
It is usually framed around the fittest individual. The individual best adapted to its immediate environment survives, reproduces, and acts entirely in its own selfish interest.
But that entire narrative fractures the moment you look closely at the natural world.
It really does.
Nature presents us with a glaring paradox that stumped early evolutionary biologists. Altruism.
Yeah.
If evolution is purely driven by selfish individuals prioritizing their own survival at all costs, how do we mechanically explain a worker bee?
Right, because a worker bee will actively sting a predator to protect the hive, knowing full well the act will literally rip its own abdomen apart.
Resulting in certain death.
And female worker ants are an even more extreme example. They are born completely sterile.
Right, they can't even reproduce.
They toil their entire lives for the colony, building complex structures, defending the territory, gathering resources until they
Drop dead from exhaustion.
Yeah. Exactly. They never reproduce. There's absolutely zero individual selfishness in that equation.
And those insects aren't anomalies either. We see this behavior spanning across vastly different species.
Right, like monkeys adopting orphaned infants that share none of their direct lineage.
Or wolves bringing fresh meat back to feed older, non-hunting members of their pack.
Or one of my favorites, the California ground squirrels. They'll stand up tall and scream their heads off to warn the rest of the colony that a hawk is circling.
An act which instantly makes the screaming squirrel a primary target.
Right. So if natural selection is solely about the individual surviving, altruistic suicide shouldn't exist.
It shouldn't. So if the individual isn't the primary unit of selection, the next logical guess people make is survival of the species.
Or group selection.
Right, group selection. The idea is that the ground squirrel sacrifices itself so the broader squirrel species can endure.
Which sounds very poetic.
It does, but from a rigorous biological standpoint, the math doesn't hold up.
That's...
Think about the fundamental requirements for natural selection to occur.
Yeah.
First, you need an entity that makes copies of itself.
Okay.
Second, you need a pruning process, an environment where some copies are destroyed and the successful copies go on to proliferate.
Right.
The fundamental flaw with group selection is that entire species don't typically make copies of themselves to compete against other species' copies.
Yeah, you don't have an entire population of squirrels somehow giving birth to a duplicate population of squirrels, and then those two massive groups fight it out for resources.
Exactly. So if the individual isn't the thing being copied and selected, and the group isn't the thing being copied and selected,
What is?
to accurately answer that, we have to travel back roughly 4 billion years.
Okay, let's do it.
We need to look at the primordial Earth long before anything we would recognize as biology even existed?
So picture a vast microscopic void,
Right.
a primordial soup. There is no life, no complex
But
organisms.
just basic chemistry.
Amino acids, water molecules, carbon dioxide, ammonia, simple, lifeless compounds floating randomly in an ancient ocean.
Occasionally, this chemical soup receives a massive jolt of energy, a strike of lightning, intense ultraviolet radiation from the young sun, or extreme heat from deep-sea hydrothermal vents,
And this energy forces these simple molecules to bump into each other and form chemical bonds.
creating slightly more complex compounds.
Hmm.
But most of these new structures are incredibly unstable and dissolve back into their basic components within milliseconds.
But the law of stability dictates a different outcome over deep time. Purely by chance and the strict laws of physics, a specific configuration eventually forms that happens to be stable.
It doesn't dissolve.
Right. The unstable compounds vanish, but the stable ones endure and accumulate.
So fast forward millions of years, and this primordial ocean is getting crowded with these stable, complex molecules. And then a statistical inevitability occurs.
A molecule forms with a highly unique chemical property. It acts as a template.
Think of it like a molecular magnetic puzzle piece. This new molecule has a specific geometric shape and chemical charge that naturally attracts distinct free-floating building blocks from the surrounding water.
So if one side of the molecule has a positive charge, it pulls in a specific negatively charged nucleotide.
Piece by piece, the surrounding basic materials are pulled into perfect alignment along this template molecule until snap. A chemical bond forms across the entire structure.
The template pulls away and a perfect duplicate is left behind. Spontaneous chemical replication has just been born.
And we really have to pause and emphasize this point. There is absolutely no intent or consciousness here.
None. This original replicator does not have a brain. It doesn't have a grand biological desire to conquer the primordial soup.
It is a completely lifeless string of chemistry, strictly obeying thermodynamic laws.
But when you're dealing with millions of years and trillions of chemical interactions, an event that seems statistically impossible eventually becomes mathematically inevitable.
That replicator only needs to get lucky once. And once it exists, exponential growth takes over. 1 becomes 2, 2 become 4, 4 become 8.
It rapidly begins using up all the free-floating amino acids and nucleotides in the environment.
But crucially, no copying process in the universe is perfectly flawless.
Right errors begin to creep into the code. A stray UV ray hits a replicator right as it's duplicating, or the environment runs low on a specific building block, forcing a slightly different chemical to snap into place.
We call these copying errors mutations.
And many of these mutations are catastrophic, right? They make the new copy unstable and it instantly falls apart.
Yes, some mutations are entirely neutral, but a tiny fraction of these copying errors actually make the new version faster or more efficient at replicating.
Which transforms the peaceful primordial soup into a microscopic battleground. The free-floating building blocks are now a fiercely limited resource.
The different variations of replicators are suddenly in direct competition with one another.
So to dominate this environment, a replicator needs to hit a very specific mathematical sweet spot.
It needs a high replication rate to outmultiply its rivals.
Okay.
It needs a low death rate, meaning it is structurally robust enough to withstand a chaotic environment, and it requires a relatively low mutation rate.
It's a massive evolutionary tightrope, right? You need a few random mutations to adapt and outcompete your neighbors. But if your mutation rate is too high, you literally lose the winning chemical recipe that made you successful in the first place.
You mutate yourself into oblivion.
Exactly.
Precisely. The successful replicators are the ones that can faithfully lock in a winning formula and duplicate it accurately.
And as resources grow scarcer, the mutations become more aggressive. Imagine a replicator that randomly develops a chemical property allowing it to actively break apart rival molecules and harvest their components.
It is essentially just invented microscopic predation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That predatory mutation creates an immediate, immense selective pressure for defense.
The replicators that survive this new threat are the ones that happen to mutate protective physical barriers.
They begin constructing walls out of surrounding proteins to shield their fragile internal structure.
It initiates a billion-year blind arms race.
Yeah.
They don't just stop at building protein walls. Random trial and error leads to replicators that build little whip-like tails or flagella for propulsion.
They develop primitive chemical sensors to detect high concentrations of resources.
They evolve mechanisms to capture and store energy. They are continuously building increasingly elaborate mechanized scaffolding around themselves.
That is a deeply humbling shift in perspective. To think that the complexity of the human body, the oak tree outside your window, the dog sleeping on your floor, is essentially just a giant, impossibly complex survival vessel.
Yeah.
We were built from the bottom up by ancient replicating molecules simply to ensure they get protected, nourished, and copied into the next generation.
And we don't refer to them as replicators anymore.
What do we call them?
We call them genes. Strands of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, heavily fortified deep inside the nucleus of almost every single cell in your body.
It completely upends the traditional narrative. We're often taught that our physical traits, our complex eyes, our advanced brains, our opposable thumbs exist to serve us, the individual.
But under this framework, the individual is just a disposable, temporary transport vehicle. The gene is the true driver of evolution.
So let's clarify why the gene is considered the fundamental unit of natural selection, rather than something smaller or larger. Why isn't the unit a single letter of DNA, like a lone nucleotide?
Well, a single nucleotide, just one isolated adenine, thymine, cytosine, or guanine, is too microscopically simple.
Okay.
It makes identical copies of itself, but on its own, it cannot code for a functional biological trait. If there is no physical trait produced, the environment has absolutely nothing to select for or against.
You can't have natural selection without a physical manifestation to test against the environment.
Exactly.
Conversely, an entire chromosome is far too massive to be the unit of selection. A single chromosome contains the code for thousands of different traits.
Furthermore, during sexual reproduction, chromosomes don't get passed down perfectly intact. They are sliced up, swapped around, and heavily recombined.
Right. The genetic deck gets completely randomized with every single generation.
Meaning a full chromosome doesn't survive long enough in a static state to be reliably selected for.
Which leaves the gene as the ultimate Goldilocks unit.
Yes. A gene is a specific sequence of DNA that is long enough to code for a distinct physical trait or behavioral instinct, like eye color or an adrenaline response, but short enough that it generally survives the genetic shuffling process of reproduction entirely intact.
Passing faithfully from generation to generation.
Correct.
This gene-centric view of evolution was most famously synthesized by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene.
It was a highly controversial paradigm shift at the time, directly challenging the flawed group selection models.
Dawkins argued that organisms are essentially highly advanced robot vehicles, blindly programmed to preserve these selfish molecules.
The genes that manage to maximize their own replication are the ones that populate the Earth, even if their methods appear completely counterintuitive to the survival of the individual vehicle.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this mathematical lens elegantly resolves the paradox of altruism we discussed at the start of the deep dive.
Let's revisit that California ground squirrel screaming at the approaching hawk.
Okay.
Let's assume there is a specific gene, or a tight cluster of genes, that programs the neurological instinct to sound an alarm when a predator's shadow passes overhead.
Sounding that alarm draws the hawk's immediate attention. That specific individual squirrel is highly likely to be killed.
The physical copy of the screaming gene residing inside that squirrel's cells is going to be permanently destroyed.
On the surface, orchestrating the death of your own transport vehicle sounds like a disastrous strategy for a supposedly selfish gene.
It does, until you pan out and analyze the audience receiving the warning.
Right. The squirrel lives in a densely populated colony surrounded by extended family.
Because of the mechanics of genetic inheritance, she shares exactly 50% of her genetic code with her siblings.
She shares 25% with her aunts and uncles and 12.5% with her cousins.
Think about how you'd react if you saw a car speeding toward your sibling versus a complete stranger.
That intense, almost blinding instinctual urge to protect your close family, Dawkins would argue that's not just human love or morality.
No.
That is the cold, hard math of kin selection firing in your brain to protect shared genetic code outside of your own body.
The famous evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane summarized this beautifully before Dawkins even wrote his book.
What did he say?
When asked if he would give his life to save his brother, Haldane reportedly calculated the genetic math in his head and replied, "No, but I would to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins."
Wow. The math checks out perfectly.
It does.
So the squirrel sees the hawk, the genetic programming triggers the scream, she gets eaten.
Right.
But because of her vital warning, 4 of her siblings have time to dive down their burrows and survive the hunt.
Those 4 surviving siblings each possess a 50% statistical probability of carrying that exact same screaming gene.
By sacrificing one physical copy of itself inside the screaming squirrel, the gene successfully guaranteed the survival of 2 copies of itself spread across the rescued siblings.
It is absolute ruthless calculus. The gene isn't sacrificing itself out of the goodness of its microscopic heart, nor does it possess a sense of nobility.
From the gene's perspective, it just doubled its market share in the broader population.
It doesn't care which biological robot it temporarily resides inside, as long as the total net number of copies in the world increases.
And we actually see this mathematical theory confirmed through extensive field observations, right?
We do. Male ground squirrels, who typically mature, leave their home colonies, and integrate into new groups of unrelated strangers, almost never give warning calls.
Because the genetic math simply doesn't yield a return on investment in a crowd of strangers, so the behavior isn't triggered.
It is such a brilliantly cohesive framework once you look at it that way.
It really is. Biology naturally resists perfectly clean narratives.
Yes, there is significant pushback and ongoing debate around the selfish gene theory within the scientific community.
Starting with the most glaring anomaly in the entire framework, the existence of sexual reproduction.
From a purely replication-focused selfish gene perspective, sexual reproduction seems like a spectacularly terrible strategy.
You are actively taking your successful genetic code and throwing 50% of it in the trash with every single offspring you produce.
Asexual reproduction, where an organism simply clones itself, which many plants, fungi, and simple animals do, guarantees 100% transmission of your genetic material into the future.
So why do almost all complex animals rely on sex? If the gene is truly selfish, giving up half its legacy makes zero logical sense.
This is an area of intense ongoing debate, but one of the prevailing biological theories is the Red Queen hypothesis. The Red Queen hypothesis suggests that organisms must constantly adapt, evolve, and shuffle their genetic decks just to survive against ever-evolving opposing organisms.
Particularly fast-mutating parasites, viruses, and pathogens.
If you simply clone yourself, you are a static biological target. A parasite will quickly crack your genetic defense code and wipe out your entire cloned lineage.
So sexual reproduction forces constant genetic mixing. It creates a continuously moving target for diseases.
The specific genes that regulate the process of sexual reproduction might be playing an incredibly long game.
They are actively sacrificing short-term 100% transmission rates to ensure the long-term survival of the overall biological vehicle against microscopic invaders.
This raises an important question about the limits of the selfish gene metaphor, specifically regarding the role of pure chance.
The framework can sometimes trick us into assuming that every single biological trait is a perfectly honed survival tool selected for a specific calculated reason.
But that ignores the massive chaotic role of statistical variance in nature.
The sources offer a brilliant way to visualize this with the cavefish example. Imagine you have a tiny, isolated population of 20 blind cavefish living in an underground aquifer.
10 of them happen to carry a gene for green eyes, and 10 carry a gene for blue eyes.
Because they live in pitch-black darkness and the fish are functionally blind anyway, the color of their eyes provides absolutely zero survival advantage or disadvantage.
Natural selection cannot see the trait to prune it. It is entirely neutral to their survival.
But as they reproduce over the years, they are drawing from this remarkably tiny genetic pool.
Just through random statistical fluctuations, like flipping a coin 20 times, the next generation might result in 12 blue-eyed fish and 8 green-eyed fish.
The generation after that might skew to 15 blue and 5 green. Over enough generations, purely by the luck of the draw, the green-eye gene might vanish from the population completely.
That phenomenon is known as genetic drift. A specific gene won out and another was eradicated, not because one built a fundamentally superior survival machine, but simply because it won a statistical coin toss.
So the key insight here is that survival of the fittest is only half the evolutionary story. The other half is survival of the luckiest.
And we also have to be remarkably careful with the word selfish. It is a highly evocative, sticky metaphor, but it can be profoundly misleading.
We have to continually remind ourselves that molecules do not have agency.
They aren't plotting strategies in a microscopic boardroom inside your cells.
What looks to us like a brilliantly calculated, selfish biological strategy, is merely the inevitable mechanical result of a chemical process that happened to be exceptionally stable and efficient at duplication.
Plus, reducing all of biology down to a simple one gene equals one trait equation ignores the staggering complexity of modern genetics. Biology is infinitely messier than that.
Incredibly messy. The field of epigenetics shows us that your environment, ambient temperature, chronic stress levels, nutritional intake can actively turn certain genes on or off without altering the underlying code at all.
One gene might influence dozens of different physiological traits, and a single physical trait might be governed by a symphony of hundreds of interacting genes.
Not to mention the immense stretches of non-coding DNA that don't seem to build proteins or traits at all, but still manage to hitch a ride in the survival machine generation after generation.
Biology vigorously resists simple narratives.
So what does this all mean? We've taken you on a massive journey today, from lifeless chemical replication in a primordial ocean to the idea that your physical body is essentially a biological mech suit piloted by ancient, selfish molecules.
Why should you care about this fundamental shift in perspective?
Yeah, why should they care?
I think it's entirely fair to admit that viewing yourself as a temporary flesh robot built by unthinking microscopic replicators can initially feel somewhat grim.
It can feel reductive, like it strips away the poetry of the human experience.
But as an analytical scientific lens, it is breathtakingly powerful. It cuts straight through the overwhelming confusion of the natural world.
When you stop looking at the animal as the primary actor and start looking at the underlying mathematics of the genetic code, deeply bizarre and seemingly counterproductive animal behaviors suddenly make perfect logical sense.
And honestly, adopting this framework doesn't mean you have to walk around feeling like a puppet on a microscopic string.
Even if our biology was constructed from the bottom up by these ancient replicating molecules, the end result of that 4 billion-year arms race was a highly advanced central nervous system and a brain that perceives the world with genuine consciousness.
You're your own acting, thinking, feeling unit.
Your genes might have built the neural architecture, but you get to decide what to have for breakfast.
Precisely. We can thoroughly understand and appreciate the microscopic machinery of our origins without allowing it to rigidly dictate the meaning of our daily existence.
But I do want to leave you with one final provocative thought, something that naturally cascades from everything we've explored today.
Let's hear it.
For roughly 4 billion years, the replicators have been the unquestioned architects of life. They built the chemical walls, they built the plants, the fungi, the animals, and us.
We were simply their heavily armored survival machines, blindly carrying their code forward into the future.
They have always been the authors of the biological story.
Until right now.
Because human consciousness has evolved to a completely unprecedented threshold. We haven't just mapped the human genome, we have invented active genetic engineering.
We have developed tools like CRISPR, which act like a pair of programmable microscopic scissors, allowing us to actively splice, edit, and rewrite the fundamental code of life.
For the very first time in the 4 billion-year history of the Earth, the survival machine has turned around, looked closely at the code inside its own cells, and figured out how to rewrite the replicator.
It is the ultimate biological plot twist.
So as you go about your day, think about that. If the survival machine is now actively editing the underlying blueprints, who is really in the driver's seat?